Hello, my name is Andrew Umdahl, and today I'll be informing you about rotational grazing for cattle. I plan to cover three main points: what rotational grazing is, the different types of rotational grazing, and the conservation benefits that come from rotational grazing. With that being said, rotational grazing impacts land conservation and cattle management. For those of you that don't know what rotational grazing is, it is a grazing technique where you rotate your cattle from area to area or from pasture to pasture. So if you have a pasture that has 4 different areas in it, you turn your cattle into one of those areas. So 25% of your pasture is being grazed, while the other 75% of your pasture is being rested and it is recovering. The vegetation is growing and the land is being rested. So once your cattle are done grazing in that 25% area, you turn them into another area. So that area can then rest and the vegetation can grow and the land can recover and so on. When I first started out, I planned to cover the different types of rotational grazing, but I came to find out that there really isn't different types of rotational grazing. The only way you can have different types of rotational grazing is by having smaller areas where you turn your cattle into, like having more percentage of your pasture being rested and a smaller percent being grazed. This type of rotational grazing is actually called rest rotational grazing. The conservation benefits that come from rotational grazing are really endless. But to name a few, I guess, the land is really conserved by rotational grazing. Woolfolk states in his research article from March 1960 that 7 years before a drought, a pasture that had been rested 3 full seasons and 3 half seasons produced more vegetation and more grass than a pasture that had been continuously grazed for 7 full seasons. So that just goes to show that rotational grazing helps your land. The environment is also impacted by rotational grazing. Undersander, Cosgrove, Albert, Johnson, and Peterson state in their book Pastures for Profit, A Guide to Rotational Grazing, that more than 2 tons of soil per acre is eroded from cropland fields in Wisconsin, where only 0.1 or 0.2 tons are being eroded away from rotational grazing areas. The reason why it's not the erosion is not as bad as the cropland fields is because the vegetation is always present and it keeps the soil there so it can't be blown away or washed away. Wildlife are another thing that is conserved by rotational grazing. As your cattle are in the half that or in the area where they're grazing, the area where they are not in, the wildlife move in and they can nest and make habitat in that area, and it's really good for the wildlife just to kind of be away from the cattle. With that being said, I hope I was able to inform you guys about what rotational grazing is, the different types of rotational grazing, the conservation benefits. Although I could only name a few, I wish there's quite a few more. Like I said, rotational grazing impacts land conservation and cattle management. Thanks for watching, you guys.